Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Vanderbilt mansion, where power and fortune ruled every breath, a single moment changed everything. She was only a seamstress, hidden in the shadows, summoned to mend a gown. He was the heir to an empire, restless and defiant. Yet in the hush of that fateful evening, their eyes met, and one reckless kiss defied the iron laws of society. What began as a scandal would become a battle between duty and desire, between the weight of fortune and the strength of love. Tell me, from where are you listening to this story? And do you believe love can truly triumph over the judgment of an unforgiving world? New York City, winter of 1883. The snow fell in fine, deliberate flakes that morning, coating the cobbled streets of Manhattan with a hush that seemed almost reverent. Inside a narrow brick building nestled between a bakery and a tobacconist's shop, the warm flicker of candlelight danced across bolts of fabric. The small workroom smelled faintly of starch, beeswax, and lavender sachets long faded. It was here, beneath a modest, lace-curtained window, that Margaret Whitfield bent over her needle with the quiet devotion of a woman whose artistry lived in every stitch. Her fingers moved swiftly, gracefully, coaxing silk and taffeta into delicate pleats, her brow lightly furrowed in concentration. She wore a simple slate-grey dress with a fitted bodice, the collar buttoned to her throat, sleeves rolled just above the wrist to keep the cuffs from soiling. A faded linen apron shielded her skirt, and her chestnut-brown hair, threaded with hints of auburn, was twisted into a neat chignon, though rebellious strands curled softly at her temples. Across the room, seated in a worn velvet armchair, Evelyn Whitfield observed her daughter with a faint smile. Once known for her elegance, Evelyn now wore a wool shawl over her shoulders and kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the slight tremor that came with the cold. "You shape the world, Maggie," she murmured, her voice tender but tinged with the fatigue of long years. "One gown at a time." Margaret smiled without looking up. "The world just doesn't know it yet." Outside, carriages clattered past, but the Whitfield women remained in their quiet refuge, transforming bolts of fine fabric into masterpieces for women who would never learn their names. On that morning, Margaret hemmed a gown of sapphire silk, ordered for a Mrs. Wentworth, a senator's wife, its color deep as the Hudson at night. She had never worn anything so fine, yet she dreamed, often and quietly. In moments of solitude, she imagined what it might feel like to glide across a ballroom, to hear her name whispered with admiration instead of pity, to be seen, not as a servant, not as a craftsman, but as a woman. By early afternoon, as she tidied her table and folded yards of brocade, a knock at the door startled them both. Margaret opened it to find a young messenger in livery, his cheeks pink from the cold. "Miss Whitfield?" he asked. "There's been an emergency at the Vanderbilt residence. A gown has torn, and they've requested your immediate assistance. You're to come at once." Margaret blinked, stunned. "This evening? The dinner begins at 7. You'll be expected by 6. Without waiting for a response, he handed her a folded slip of parchment and vanished into the snow. Evelyn reached for the paper as Margaret closed the door. "It's their seal," she whispered, running her fingers over the golden crest. "The Vanderbilts." The very name conjured images of opulence beyond imagining. Ballrooms lit by gaslight chandeliers, crystal decanters, gloves of kid leather, and gowns stitched with pearls. Margaret stood still for a moment, unsure whether to feel dread or disbelief. "They wouldn't summon you unless they were desperate," her mother added gently. "You must go." "But I've nothing to wear." "You're not there to be admired," Evelyn interrupted, her tone firm despite the rasp in her breath. "You're there to do what you do better than anyone." Margaret hesitated, then nodded, already reaching for her sewing kit, the scissors, the ivory-handled needles wrapped in muslin. She washed her hands twice, changed into a clean cotton dress, and wrapped herself in her thickest wool cloak. The carriage that arrived at dusk bore the Vanderbilt crest on its door, and when she stepped inside, Margaret could no longer deny that she was being carried into a world unlike any she had ever known. By the time she arrived, the mansion on Fifth Avenue was alight with hundreds of gas lamps, its windows aglow like a palace in a fairy tale. Liveried footmen opened the door with practiced precision, and Margaret was ushered swiftly through back corridors and up a narrow stairwell, past marble statues and velvet drapes that seemed too luxurious to even look at. She was brought to a small dressing room where a lady's maid, red-faced and breathless, handed her a ball gown of blush-pink silk. The right sleeve had torn at the seam. "Miss Harrington will be announced in less than 20 minutes, the maid hissed. "Can you mend it?" Margaret nodded silently and set to work. The room was quiet, save for the delicate hiss of the gas sconces and the occasional sound of the maid pacing. Margaret's fingers worked as if guided by instinct. She was not thinking. She was feeling, moving with an urgency sharpened by years of experience. When she finished, the seam was nearly invisible. "Go now," the maid urged. "Down that hallway, through the east ballroom, cut across the corner to avoid the guests." But as Margaret emerged, clutching her sewing kit to her chest, she took a wrong turn, and suddenly she stood at the threshold of the main ballroom. The sight took her breath away. Chandeliers heavy with crystal prisms glowed like stars overhead. The floor, polished like a mirror, reflected the swirl of silk and satin in colors she had only seen in dreams: emerald, ivory, scarlet. A quartet played a gentle waltz. Gold-rimmed goblets sparkled in candlelight. Conversations floated in refined murmurs. The air smelled of roses, champagne, and ambition. Margaret froze, her body half in shadow, the warmth of the room enveloping her in a haze of disbelief. She moved quietly along the edge, eyes lowered, attempting to vanish into the marbled walls. But her presence, modest though it was, did not go unnoticed. Charles Vanderbilt II, heir to the empire, had just turned from a polite but dull conversation with a railroad magnate's daughter. Standing tall in his evening coat, with a white cravat fastened neatly at his throat and a gold watch glinting at his waist, he looked every inch the picture of prestige, until he saw her. A woman at the edge of the room, not painted in color, not jeweled or perfumed, but real, poised, intent, almost ghost-like in her quiet dignity. Their eyes met, just for a moment, but in that moment, something shifted. He tilted his head slightly, intrigued, and though Margaret turned away quickly, her heart now racing in her chest, the weight of his gaze remained. She had not meant to be seen, and yet somehow she had been, not as a servant, not as a seamstress, as a woman he would not forget. The ballroom shimmered like a dream woven of candlelight and crystal. Gentle strains of a Strauss waltz floated from the orchestra at the far end, each note polished and precise, choreographed like the couples gliding across the parquet floor. But for Charles Vanderbilt II, the son of one of the richest men in America, the music rang hollow. He stood near the gilded columns, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his expression one of elegant detachment. Dressed in the finest formal wear a tailor could offer, black tailcoat with satin lapels, ivory waistcoat, and polished shoes that reflected the chandeliers above, he looked every inch the Vanderbilt heir. Yet his thoughts wandered far from the sparkle of debutantes and titled guests. The evening had been endless, the same conversations, the same practiced smiles, the same parade of eligible daughters glancing at him over lace fans and crystal flutes. Their laughter floated like perfume, sweet, light, and utterly forgettable. He turned away from the latest introduction, murmuring something polite, and stepped into the periphery of the ballroom, seeking refuge near the long windows. The night air pressed cool against the glass, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the crowded room. He sighed, loosening his white gloves, with the impatience of a man who had inherited too much too soon. and found little in it to satisfy him. Then he saw her. Across the room, almost hidden behind a potted palm near the servants' corridor, stood a young woman with an air of quiet self-possession that made her stand out more than the jeweled gowns around her. Her dress was modest, dark, and unadorned, but it could not hide the elegance in her posture, nor the delicate strength in her hands as she pressed them to a small sewing case. He watched her without knowing why. Perhaps it was the way she remained still amid the swirling crowd, or the way her eyes moved, not with hunger or calculation, but with restraint. Her gaze did not seek attention. It resisted it. She turned her head slightly, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Not the glance of a lady toward a suitor, not the gaze of a servant toward a master. It was something else, something honest. And in that flicker of connection, something shifted in Charles's chest, like a thread pulled taut. He set down his untouched champagne and crossed the room. Margaret felt him approach before she saw him. The air seemed to change, a ripple of unease passing through the dancers, like fabric disturbed by an unseen hand. She kept her head lowered, but her heart betrayed her with its sudden violent rhythm. He stopped before her. "I believe you've sown your way straight into the center of a storm," he said gently, his voice low and smooth, laced with a warmth that startled her. She looked up then, her breath caught in her throat. He was taller than she remembered, impossibly polished, with eyes the color of burnished hazel, and a smile that did not quite reach his mouth, but lit something beneath it. "I meant no intrusion, sir," she replied quietly. "I was only trying to leave unnoticed." "A curious goal," he murmured, "for someone who looks as though she belongs in oil and gold frame." She blushed deeply, the words cutting through her carefully built armor. "I'm a seamstress," she said with dignity, "not a guest." "That explains your grace, then," he said, tilting his head. "It's practiced, earned." She lowered her gaze again, trying to ignore the way her throat tightened. "You shouldn't speak to me this way," she said softly. "Not here, not like this." "And yet," he replied, stepping slightly closer, "I can't seem to stop." Their words were few, but the silence between them said far more. In that space, the scent of roses, the strain of violins, and the dull murmur of society faded. All that remained was the electric hush of being seen, truly seen. Margaret felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She clutched her case more tightly, unsure whether to curtsy, flee, or stand her ground. Every instinct told her that this moment could unravel everything she had worked to protect. "Excuse me," she murmured, turning to slip behind a marble column, her footsteps quiet but rushed. She didn't see him follow. Charles, drawn as if by a force he could neither name nor defy, moved through the crowd with the silent confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But for once, it was not obedience he sought. It was clarity. He found her just beyond the column, where the music grew softer, near the entrance to the adjoining parlor. The shadows fell gentler there, touched by the flicker of a nearby gas sconce. Margaret had paused, one hand pressed to her chest as though trying to still the trembling beneath it. He said nothing at first. Then, softly, "I don't know your name." She turned, startled. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." There was no pretense in his voice, no arrogance, no mask of flirtation, only a quiet urgency. "Margaret," she whispered. He stepped closer. "Margaret," he repeated, as though trying the name on his tongue. "I'm Charles." She knew, of course. Everyone knew. He stood so near now that she could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the gleam of gold at his cufflink, the pulse at his throat. And still, she did not step back. Neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what hovered between them defied language. A waltz began anew. And in a moment that should never have belonged to them, Charles offered his hand. "Dance with me." She stared at him, aghast. "I cannot." "You can." "I'm not. You're the only one I want to dance with." His hand remained outstretched, steady and patient. Margaret looked around. Eyes watched, lips whispered. She could feel the tension gathering like a storm cloud above her head. But her hand, traitorous and trembling, reached for his. He pulled her gently into the edge of the dance floor. The crowd parted slightly, not in welcome, but in stunned disbelief. The orchestra did not falter, but the atmosphere grew charged. A seamstress on the Vanderbilt floor. He placed one hand at her waist, his other clasping hers. She could hardly breathe. They danced. Each movement felt suspended in glass, as if time itself paused to watch. Her body followed the rhythm out of instinct, muscle memory from years spent fitting gowns and observing society from the shadows. But this was something else. Their eyes never left each other. Then, as the final notes of the waltz trembled into silence, Charles leaned forward and kissed her. It was not a lover's kiss, nor the practiced seduction of a man used to conquest. It was urgent, real, a man drowning in expectation, gasping for truth, and finding it in the most forbidden place. Gasps echoed through the ballroom like shattered glass. A matron dropped her fan. A gentleman coughed awkwardly. The music stopped altogether. Margaret's body stiffened in his arms. And then she pulled away. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, burned with something between anger and anguish. She turned and fled, past the gawking eyes, past the gilded staircases, into the cold corridors of the house, until she no longer heard the whispers. Charles remained frozen in place, the echo of her touch lingering on his lips. From the far end of the ballroom, Cornelius Vanderbilt stepped forward, his expression carved from marble. His eyes met his son's, and the room fell into silence. The scandal had begun. The morning after the Vanderbilt dinner dawned with a cruel, unseasonable brightness. Sunlight spilled across the rooftops of Fifth Avenue as if the world were unaware or indifferent to the storm that had begun within its most opulent walls. In parlours scented with jasmine and tobacco, in conservatories glazed with frost, and in dressing rooms where maids laced corsets and fastened diamond brooches, one name passed from mouth to mouth: Margaret Whitfield. Her name, once unknown to society, was now a source of both scandal and amusement, but it was not spoken with admiration. It dripped from lips curled with disdain, folded into whispers wrapped in silk. "A seamstress," murmured the Marchioness of Pembroke over her tea. "How vulgar!" "They say she bewitched him with some common charm," replied her companion, fanning herself slowly. "That she's been sewing for the family for years. Imagine the opportunities." "I heard she followed him into the garden," said another, "deliberately." "No, it was the ballroom, in front of everyone. The orchestra stopped playing." And then the inevitable conclusion, spoken in every drawing room from Madison to Gramercy. She knew exactly what she was doing. The story changed shape with every retelling, but the ending remained the same. Margaret Whitfield, a young woman of no fortune and no name, had dared to draw the attention of Charles Vanderbilt II, and for that she would be punished, mercilessly, elegantly, and without hesitation. Among those leading the charge was Isabella Harrington. She had watched from across the ballroom the night before, her lips parted in shock, her gloved hand tightening around her fan until the ivory snapped. The humiliation had not been hers directly, but she felt it like a lash across her pride. Isabella had spent 2 seasons cultivating her place beside Charles. Every conversation carefully measured, every gown designed to flatter, every glance calculated. She had listened to his frustrations, laughed at his ironies, danced every opening waltz. And then, a seamstress, a nobody. She stood now before her dressing mirror, her hair in loose waves, as her maid prepared to twist it into the fashionable coil. Her eyes were sharp as ice, narrowed with purpose. "She'll regret it," Isabella said softly, watching her own reflection. "And so will he." Her voice did not rise. She did not scream or sob. No, the fire that lived in Isabella was slow and cold, a flame that consumed with silence. By midday, whispers had reached the ears of every woman who mattered. But none of those voices entered the small, dim workshop where Margaret Whitfield sat in stillness, a piece of muslin untouched in her lap. She had not eaten. She had not spoken. Only her mother's voice broke the heavy silence. "They speak because they fear," said Evelyn, seated across from her, a teacup growing cold in her hand. "Because you dared to be more than they imagined." Margaret raised her eyes slowly, her lashes still damp. "They speak because I was foolish," she whispered. "Because I forgot who I am, and I let him. She couldn't finish. Evelyn set down her cup with trembling fingers and reached for her daughter's hand. "You did nothing wrong. You stood where you were sent. You sowed what they demanded. What happened was not your fault." Margaret shook her head. "But they think I wanted it, that I planned it, that I—" Evelyn tightened her grip. "And what do you know in your heart?" Margaret's lips quivered. "That I never meant to be seen. That I tried to walk away." Evelyn nodded. "Then let that be your truth. Let the world believe what it wishes. It has never known what to do with a woman who doesn't bow." Outside, footsteps passed the shop. A neighbour's child laughed. A carriage rolled by. Inside, the shadows wrapped around them like cloaks. The day wore on. Clients did not arrive. The usual rustle of fabric, the hum of the sewing machine, the rhythm of scissors and pins, all were absent. Margaret's hands, once so sure, now trembled with uncertainty. Just before sunset, a knock. She rose slowly, expecting a vendor or a delivery boy. But it was neither. Standing on the stoop was a young boy in a navy blue cap, holding a sealed envelope. His coat bore the insignia of the Vanderbilt household. "For Miss Margaret Whitfield," he said. "From Mr. Charles." She stared at the parchment. Her breath caught. Her fingers reached for it, then hesitated. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. The boy nodded once, then disappeared into the dusk. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, the letter clutched to her chest. She did not open it at once. She walked to the back of the workshop, past bolts of fabric, past the broken sewing box, and into the narrow hall where the light was dim. There she broke the seal. The handwriting was strong, but careful. "Margaret, forgive the boldness of this letter. I know that after what happened last night, the world has turned its gaze upon you in the most unforgiving way. I cannot stop the noise, but I can offer you this truth. I do not regret what I did. Not the dance, not the kiss, not a single moment in which I saw you for who you are. I know that my name casts a long shadow, and that stepping into it has brought you pain. But I will not abandon you. Not now, not ever. I do not ask anything of you in return. Only that you know this was not a passing whim. You stirred something in me that has long been asleep, something real. Please forgive the world for its cruelty. It does not know how to honor a heart like yours. Charles." Her eyes lingered on the signature, the ink slightly smudged. She read the letter once, then again, as if it might vanish. Then, with great care, she folded it, wrapped it in a square of muslin, and placed it inside the lining of her sewing case, beneath the pincushion. She would not destroy it, but she could not let it live in plain sight. It was both a treasure and a curse, hope and fear wrapped in paper and ink. That night, she lay in bed beside her mother, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Evelyn slept lightly, her breath uneven, her hand resting over Margaret's wrist. Margaret stared at the ceiling, her thoughts unraveling like threads. She wanted to believe in his words, in the warmth of his voice, the sincerity in his gaze. But how could she? How could she stand against the fury of a world built to crush women like her? She turned to the window, where the moon hung low and pale, veiled by clouds, and she whispered into the darkness, "If I let myself believe, I may not survive the fall." But her heart, traitorous and trembling, had already leapt. The Vanderbilt mansion loomed in solemn silence that morning, its heavy doors closed against the winter wind, and its marble halls as cold as the man who ruled them. In the vast study, where the drapes were never drawn and the clock ticked with the gravity of an empire, Cornelius Vanderbilt stood facing the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. His grey hair was brushed immaculately, his frock coat flawless, but his eyes, pale and unyielding, were sharper than the edge of a blade. He did not turn when his son entered. Charles crossed the threshold with quiet resolve, his footsteps echoing off the marble floor. He had not slept. The circles beneath his eyes betrayed the toll of a night spent writing letters he could not send and rereading one he had dared to deliver. "You wished to see me," he said, his voice measured, low. Cornelius remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. Then he spoke, his tone devoid of warmth. "I never imagined," he said slowly, "that I would live to see a Vanderbilt son publicly humiliate our family name. For a seamstress." Charles said nothing. Cornelius finally turned, his face carved from granite. "You will end it today, immediately." Charles held his ground. "No." A silence followed, heavy as iron. "No?" Cornelius repeated, almost amused. "You believe this is a negotiation?" "I believe," Charles replied, "that I have the right to choose the path of my own life." The elder Vanderbilt stepped closer, his presence towering. "You live under my roof. You wear my name. Every stone beneath your feet was paid for with my fortune. And you think you have the right to throw it all away over some girl with calloused hands and no bloodline." Charles's eyes flared. "She has more dignity than half the people who sit at our table," he said quietly. Cornelius's voice rose, icy and sharp. "She is nothing. You will not see her again. You will make a statement to the press denying any affection. You will dance with Isabella Harrington at the Rutherford Gala next week and remind New York of your place." "I won't," Charles answered, firmer now. "I won't lie, and I won't pretend." Cornelius's hand struck the desk with a violent crack. "Then you will be cut off." The words fell like a verdict. "I will rewrite the will. Your name will vanish from the holdings. The railroads, the banks, the estates, all of it will go to your cousin Edgar. You will have nothing." Charles breathed in slowly. His jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. "Then so be it." Cornelius stared at him, incredulous. "You're willing to destroy your future for a woman who cannot even stand beside you in a ballroom?" Charles met his father's gaze without flinching. "She's the only person in that room who made me feel like a man, not a title." For a long, bitter moment, neither spoke. Then Cornelius turned his back, returning to the fire. "Very well," he said coldly. "You may walk toward your ruin, but she will not." Charles's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I won't touch you, Charles. You've made your choice. But the girl, Margaret, she can be persuaded." Charles took a step forward, fists clenched at his sides. "If you harm her—" "Don't be dramatic," Cornelius interrupted. "I won't need to lift a finger. I only need to remind her of what awaits a woman who attaches herself to scandal. No work, no future, no place." Charles's heart pounded. He turned and left the room without another word, knowing that his father, silent, methodical, relentless, would now begin to move the wheels of society against the woman he loved. That same afternoon, in the tea rooms and garden parlors of Upper Manhattan, Isabella Harrington began her performance. With calculated grace, she drifted from one conversation to the next, dressed in a velvet walking gown of periwinkle blue, her voice soft and wounded. "I worry for Charles," she sighed to the Baroness of Astor Hill. "He's been confused lately." "You mean the girl?" the Baroness whispered. Isabella's eyes filled with feigned sorrow. "She's been working for the family for years, I suppose. It was inevitable he'd notice her. She's clever that way, always appearing just when he's most vulnerable. And you think she—" "Oh, I would never accuse anyone of manipulation," Isabella said gently. "But one must protect young men from such illusions." But by evening, the story had transformed again. Margaret had seduced Charles. She had plotted to elevate herself through the affections of a Vanderbilt. She had feigned innocence to hide ambition. And in her small workshop on East 22nd Street, Margaret Whitfield felt the walls closing in. Letters stopped arriving. Clients cancelled their orders. A banker's wife returned a half-finished gown without explanation. The silence was louder than the gossip itself. At home, Evelyn grew pale and quieter each day, her hands shaking when she held her teacup. Margaret sat by the window, watching the snow drift in soft flurries past the glass, her heart a tangle of guilt and defiance. She clutched Charles's letter, still hidden beneath her pincushion, and pressed it to her chest. Was she leading him to ruin? Had her presence already cost him more than she had any right to ask? And yet... She closed her eyes and remembered the sound of his voice in the quiet corner of the ballroom, the way he had looked at her, not as a conquest, not as a scandal, but as if she mattered, as if she were his equal. That night, long after the city had gone to sleep, Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the cold. The streets were hushed, and the lamps glowed like stars shrouded in fog. She walked with purpose, her boots crunching softly in the snow, until she reached the wrought-iron gate of the Vanderbilt gardens. And there, beneath the branches of a bare sycamore, he waited. Charles stepped forward the moment he saw her, his breath misting in the air. "You came." "I had to," she whispered. They stood facing each other, the distance between them filled with unspoken truths. "I heard what your father said," she said quietly. "I know what they're saying about me." Charles's eyes darkened. "None of it matters." "But it does," she replied, her voice trembling. "They'll destroy you, Charles. I see it happening already, and she faltered. "I don't want to be the reason your name becomes a warning." He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "You're not a reason. You're the only thing that makes any of it mean something." She looked up at him, eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "So am I," he whispered. His fingers grazed her cheek just once, with reverence. Not a kiss, not a claim, a promise. The silence between them grew tender, fragile. "We're not children," she said. "We don't live in stories. The world isn't kind to people like me." "No," he said softly, "but I will be." And in that stolen hour beneath the sycamore tree, they stood like fugitives from a world that would not forgive them. Two hearts beating against the weight of inheritance, of expectation, of fear. They did not kiss. They did not swear eternal vows. But when she placed her hand gently over his heart, and he covered it with his own, it was more binding than anything spoken aloud. They would face what came, together. The morning air in New York was sharp with the chill of late January, and the city, wrapped in its winter coat of grey, moved with the slow elegance of a world too rich to rush. Gaslight flickered through the frost-covered panes of shop windows, and the clatter of hooves echoed between rows of brownstones, elegant and indifferent to the private heartbreaks carried in silence behind closed doors. Inside the modest workroom on East 22nd Street, the silence was unusual. No thread hummed beneath Margaret's fingertips. No chalk lines traced delicate fabric. No client waited with her gloves in hand. Only the ticking of the wall clock dared to mark time, each second an intrusion on her thoughts. She sat alone at her sewing table, unmoving, staring down at a length of ivory satin that would never be cut. Her mother's voice, faint from the adjoining room, called to her gently, and Margaret rose to pour a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. But she was not prepared for what awaited her beyond that morning's fragile calm. Shortly before noon, a familiar bell above the front door jingled. Margaret straightened her shoulders and stepped into the parlour, her posture calm, her gaze steady. There stood Mrs. Henley, wife of a prominent banker, draped in mink, her cheeks flushed from the cold, or perhaps from something less kind. Margaret smiled faintly. "Good morning, Mrs. Henley. I have the fitting ready." "I won't be staying," the woman interrupted, her tone clipped. Margaret blinked. I beg your pardon." Mrs. Henley placed a parcel on the counter, tied in a crisp blue ribbon. The dress Margaret had worked on for weeks. "I'll be taking my commissions elsewhere, you understand, I'm sure." Margaret's throat tightened. Is there something wrong with the alterations? No, the stitching is fine. She gave a pointed look. But reputation, Miss Whitfield, is like silk. Once stained, it cannot be restored. For a moment, Margaret could not move. Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter, as if seeking something solid to hold on to. I have always served you with care and respect, she said softly. My personal affairs are no longer personal, I'm afraid, Mrs. Henley replied, drawing her gloves on tightly. Society is watching. She turned and exited without another word, the door shutting with a final click that sounded far louder than it should have. The silence that followed was unbearable. Margaret remained standing in the middle of the room, her chest rising and falling as though she'd just run a mile uphill. Her pride burned, her skin prickled with shame, and behind her eyes, tears formed, hot, unwanted, and uncontrollable. She could not stay. Not in that room, not in that moment. She grabbed her shawl and stepped outside, letting the cold slap her cheeks red. She walked without direction, boots thudding against the slush, eyes stinging as the wind mingled with the tears she could no longer hold back. The city blurred around her. She passed no one she knew, and yet every face seemed to look through her. She felt stripped bare. Not a woman, not a daughter, not even a seamstress. Only a name dragged through the dust of gossip and ruined in the drawing rooms of people she had never met. By the time she reached her building again, her limbs were numb and her spirit heavier than it had ever been. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing with defeat. Inside, she found her mother, resting on the chaise, her face unusually pale, her breath shallow. "Mother!" Margaret rushed to her side, kneeling. "You didn't answer when I called earlier. Are you in pain?" Evelyn opened her eyes and gave a weary smile. "Just tired, my darling. The cold gets into my bones more easily these days." Margaret wrapped a blanket over her shoulders and kissed her forehead, hiding the panic rising in her throat. She would not let her mother see her cry again. Not today, but she could not hide the absence of work, the orders unfilled, the silence of the shop bell. And later that evening, when a discreet envelope was slipped beneath their door, she knew who it was from before opening it. Charles. Inside was a short note and a folded bank draft, generous, almost obscene in its kindness. "Let me help you, please. It's not charity. It's the only way I know how to protect you in a world that's made itself your enemy. See." Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the money with dry, aching eyes. Her first impulse was to tear it up. Her second was to weep. Instead, she folded it back into the envelope and tucked it beneath the teapot on the highest shelf, out of reach. She would not accept pity from the man she loved, not because his intentions were impure, but because her dignity, what little remained of it, was all she had to call her own. That weekend, the Harrington family hosted their famed annual charity ball at the Metropolitan Club, a grand affair under chandeliers the size of carriages, with a guest list composed entirely of New York's most powerful names. Margaret had no intention of attending until Mrs. Travers, a long-time client who had not yet cancelled her commissions, sent for her to assist with last-minute gown preparations. "You'll only be backstage," Mrs. Travers said, "in the dressing area. No one will even see you." And so Margaret went, carrying her needle case and trying not to tremble as she stepped into the glowing maze of silk, perfume, and orchestrated splendor. Behind the curtains she worked in silence, adjusting hems, pinning lace, and tightening corsets for women who barely acknowledged her presence. Her fingers moved automatically, but her ears betrayed her. She could hear everything. The giggles, the jabs. "The Vanderbilt boy will be here tonight," whispered one debutante. "Do you think he'll bring his seamstress?" "I heard she tried to follow him here," said another. As if she belonged. Margaret pressed her lips together and focused on a stubborn stitch. Then, amid the laughter and perfume, a hush fell. She looked up, and there he was, Charles, standing tall in his formal black, hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. At his side, radiant in a gown of pale green silk, her dark curls artfully arranged and diamonds glittering at her throat, stood Isabella Harrington. Margaret's heart clenched. Isabella smiled up at him, her hand lightly placed on his arm, her posture regal. When the music began, she turned to him with the soft elegance of a woman born to be adored. And he did not pull away. He led her onto the dance floor. They waltzed. Their bodies moved with perfect precision, the steps rehearsed, practiced. The entire room watched, murmuring approval. From behind the curtain, Margaret stood frozen, her hands numb, her breath shallow. She told herself it was only performance, that he was pretending, that he had no choice. But reason failed against the stab of the sight. She turned away. And this time she did not cry. She only stitched, the needle passing through satin as if it could sew her heart back together. But no seam would ever hide the rip. The wind howled down East 22nd Street that morning, rattling shutters and sending dust into corners long forgotten. A grey veil hung over New York City, as if even the sky could feel the weight pressing upon the quiet workshop where Margaret Whitfield had lived and worked in near silence for the past several days. The fire in the hearth burned low, more smoke than flame, and the kettle atop the stove gave only half-hearted steam. Margaret stood hunched beside it, her fingers red from cold and wear, her thoughts too heavy to be chased away by tea or light. Her mother had not risen from bed. It was not just weariness this time. It was something deeper, something that clung to Evelyn's breath and made her skin too pale, her voice too faint. Margaret carried the cup of tea into the bedroom, setting it gently beside the pillow. Evelyn turned her head weakly, offering a wan smile, but made no effort to sit up. "Just a little tired, my darling," she murmured. "It's nothing." But Margaret knew better. She pressed her lips together, trying not to show the fear rising in her chest. She tucked the blanket more tightly around Evelyn's shoulders and brushed a strand of silvered hair away from her temple. "I'll call for Dr. Fenwick this afternoon," she said gently, "and I'll fetch the cough tonic. It will help you rest." Evelyn opened her eyes then, those same grey-blue eyes Margaret saw in the mirror every day, and tried to protest. "We can't afford—" "Hush!" Margaret interrupted, forcing a softness into her tone. "We'll manage." But she didn't know how. The coins left in her sewing box were barely enough for a loaf of bread and a small bag of coal. And with commissions all but vanished, and her name now little more than a cautionary tale in every parlour north of 14th Street, her prospects had dried up like flowers pressed too long in a book. By noon, Margaret stepped into the bitter cold once more, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her eyes cast low. She went from shop to shop hoping for a last-minute order, a hem, a cuff, a repair. But the doors that once welcomed her now barely cracked open, and the glances she received were clipped, pitying, or worse. Only one woman gave her work. Mrs. Langworthy, a widow known for her sharp tongue and elaborate taste, summoned Margaret to her townhouse in Gramercy Park. "You may mend the lace on my evening gloves," the woman said, barely glancing up as Margaret entered. "And let us not pretend we haven't all heard what's been said about you. Still, I admire a woman who knows how to use her charms. Not all scandals are career-ending, you know, just the poorly managed ones." Margaret kept her eyes on the gloves and said nothing, her fingers moving with practiced precision, even as humiliation burned beneath her skin. The payment was paltry. The laughter was not. When she returned home, her boots soaked and her pride wounded, she found the doctor already leaving. "She needs warmth and rest," he said quietly, "and the medicine I've left, but it won't work without nourishment. Do what you must, Miss Whitfield. You're all she has." That night, Margaret sat by the fire, her head bowed, the envelope from Charles, still sealed beside her untouched. She considered it. Her fingers hovered over it, but she could not. And as if the weight were not already unbearable, the next morning brought something worse. A visitor. He came without announcement, but not without consequence. Mr. Latham, the family solicitor for the Vanderbilts, appeared at her door dressed in black wool, gloved and composed. His tone was formal, his words practiced. "I come on behalf of Mr. Cornelius Vanderbilt," he said, extending an envelope thick with weight and implication. "My client wishes to offer a settlement in exchange for discretion and departure." Margaret stared at him, unmoving. "Departure," she echoed. The man cleared his throat. "It is believed that your continued presence in the city may cause difficulty for all parties. This is not a threat, Miss Whitfield. It is a proposal. You may leave quietly with dignity and begin anew elsewhere." She said nothing. He placed the envelope on the counter, its contents unmistakable. Money, too much to refuse, and far too much to accept. "Consider what's best for you, for your mother," he added gently. "This world, it's not kind to women who remain once they've been cast out." Margaret lifted her eyes then, and for the first time in days, they sparked. "Tell Mr. Vanderbilt," she said quietly, "that I am not for sale, and neither is my silence." She placed the envelope back into Mr. Latham's hand. He bowed, murmured something about regret, and left. The door shut behind him with finality. Margaret stood for a long moment, shaking, then collapsed into the nearest chair, the tears coming now, not from shame, but from exhaustion, fury, and the unbearable weight of knowing just how far power could reach. The next day, New York society received its next great scandal. At the unveiling of the new portrait wing at the National Academy of Design, Charles Vanderbilt stood before a crowd of journalists and patrons and with measured boldness declared the following. "Art," he said, "is meant to reflect truth. And if truth is something to be feared, then we are not patrons, we are cowards." There was a pause, silence, and then, without prompting, he added, "I love Margaret Whitfield. She has been slandered for daring to be seen. But I will not apologize for having seen her." The gasps that followed echoed louder than applause. Later, in a marble hall filled with silk gowns and monocled stairs, Cornelius Vanderbilt heard the news and crushed his wineglass in his hand. The scandal flared anew. Editors rushed to print. Society buzzed. But in a small, quiet workshop, Margaret stood at the window, her eyes filled not with fear, but something harder, something fiercer, resolve. She had been pushed, mocked, ridiculed. But she was not broken, not yet. Winter tightened its grip on New York City, blanketing its cobbled avenues and brownstone facades with a silence that felt colder than the snow. The wind, sharp and unapologetic, swept through Fifth Avenue as if it too had joined the ranks of those eager to tear apart a name that society had once ignored and now could not stop repeating. Margaret Whitfield. The name was no longer spoken with indifference. It was whispered behind silk fans, printed in scandal sheets, and immortalized in charcoal caricatures sold at street corners for 5 cents apiece. One such drawing depicted her with exaggerated eyes and thread spools in her hair, clinging to a towering figure labeled the Vanderbilt Fortune, as if it were a lifeboat. Above the illustration ran the caption, "The seamstress who sewed her way into a legacy." It hurt more than Margaret would ever admit. Each morning, she watched Evelyn sleep while the city around them continued its slow, merciless trial. She kept the windows shuttered now, not for the cold, but to keep out the stares of neighbors who paused outside, pretending to tie shoelaces as their glances slid toward her door. Their pity was worse than their judgment, and yet she refused to hide. She took in what little work still came. She kept her shoulders straight. And when she walked through the market with her basket nearly empty, she lifted her chin, as if she carried pearls instead of bruises. Still, the humiliation bled in quiet ways. At a small tailoring shop where she once delivered trims, the shop girl offered her a used bundle of lace and called it fitting for a girl in her position. A seamstress she had once trained now refused to meet her eyes. And the newsboys, bless their ignorance, shouted her name each afternoon from the corners, selling scandal like candy. But it was Isabella Harrington who struck the cruelest blow. The invitation arrived by hand. Written in elegant script on thick vellum, it bore the Harrington crest and a polite formality that concealed its venom. Margaret was invited to an intimate dinner, hosted by the Harringtons for their patrons and artisans, an event, the note explained, to celebrate the fine work of those who serve beauty through craft. Evelyn, too weak to rise from bed, frowned as Margaret read the card aloud. "Will she be there?" Evelyn asked softly. Margaret hesitated. "Yes." "Then be careful." "I will." And so, on a Thursday evening chilled by frost and ill omens, Margaret arrived at the Harrington mansion in a borrowed shawl and her neatest dress. She carried her sewing case like armor, unaware that she was walking into a room designed not for recognition, but for spectacle. The parlour was grand and glittering. Gas lamps flickered from crystal sconces, and a fire roared in the hearth, warming the silk gowns and velvet waistcoats of New York's most polished elite. At first, Margaret stood in the shadows, uncertain. Then Isabella spotted her. "Oh, Miss Whitfield," she said, gliding forward with a smile like cut glass. "How lovely you look. Won't you join us?" Margaret offered a quiet nod, clutching her case. The room was filled with faces she had seen only from a distance, ladies she had sewn for, gentlemen whose names filled the finance pages. They turned as Isabella led her in, their expressions carefully composed. Margaret was seated at the end of the long dining table, far from conversation, but close enough to be watched. Her presence was tolerated, but not welcomed. The first course was served. Then came the first blow. "Tell us, Miss Whitfield," asked Mrs. Astor, lifting a spoon delicately. "Is it true you'll be designing your own trousseau? Quite a modern woman, I hear." Laughter rippled along the table. Margaret met her eyes calmly. "I've always believed a woman should know the quality of her own seams." The response silenced the laughter for a moment, but only a moment. Then came a whisper from the other end. "I hear her stitchwork is only matched by her talent for social climbing." Margaret said nothing. Isabella turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, come now, let's not be cruel. Miss Whitfield is simply ambitious. Aren't you, dear?" Margaret's throat burned, but she refused to lower her eyes. "If ambition means surviving without malice, then yes," she said softly. The table fell quiet again, and then came the final twist. Isabella rose with her glass, smiling sweetly. "To Charles," she said, "may he find his way back to the path from which he has so publicly strayed." Everyone drank, everyone except Margaret. The humiliation was complete, but she did not cry. She sat with her spine straight, her lips composed, and her dignity intact. If they wished to break her, they would have to try harder. The moment passed, conversations resumed, servants cleared plates, and then, as if conjured by the very fire of the room, Charles Vanderbilt appeared in the doorway. The entire table fell still. He was dressed simply, no cravat, no ornament, but the weight of his presence needed no embellishment. His eyes scanned the room until they found Margaret. He crossed to her without a word, each step echoing like a declaration. Margaret stood, startled. Charles turned to the room. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, voice calm but resolute. "I hadn't realized this was a performance." Isabella stepped forward, still smiling. "Charles, we were just insulting a woman with more courage than this entire table combined," he said. "Yes, I gathered." Gasps fluttered like birds. He turned to Margaret, his voice softer. "You don't belong here." "I was invited," she replied quietly. "And I am uninviting you," he said. "Not from society, but from this farce." He offered his hand. Margaret hesitated only a breath before placing hers in it. He turned to the room once more. "I have nothing to hide. I love Margaret Whitfield, and I will not pretend otherwise to please those who have mistaken cruelty for elegance." Silence. Shock. Stares. And then, as he led Margaret toward the door, a sound, a chair being pushed back. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe, widow of a prominent senator, stood slowly. She tapped her glass with a spoon. "I believe," she said, her voice steady, "that I would like to order a gown from Miss Whitfield." And with that, she raised her glass. Not to Charles, not to Isabella, but to Margaret. The room, uncertain, followed suit. Margaret said nothing as she stepped into the night air, her hand still in Charles's, but her heart beat with something new. Not fear, not shame, but the quiet, burning promise that dignity, when held with grace, was stronger than any scandal. And love, when dared in the open, was the boldest defiance of all. The drawing room of the Vanderbilt mansion was lit only by the dim winter sun filtering through frosted windows. Shadows clung to the walls, and the silence inside felt carved from ice. The fire had long since died in the hearth, but Cornelius Vanderbilt stood before it as if it still roared, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his expression carved in stone. Charles entered the room with the air of a man who already knew the sentence awaiting him. His father did not offer a greeting. "I had hoped," Cornelius began, "that your latest performance was simply a symptom of youth, that perhaps this infatuation, this folly, would pass." Charles remained still. "It has not." "Then allow me to be clear," the elder Vanderbilt said, turning slowly. "You have a choice. Marry Isabella Harrington, unite two legacies as planned, or lose everything, permanently." The words fell like a blade. Charles's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. "I have already made my choice," he said quietly. Cornelius stepped closer, his voice low and deadly calm. "You would throw away a future built over generations for a seamstress?" Charles's response was swift, steady. "I would throw away 1,000 fortunes to keep my soul intact." His father's eyes narrowed. "Then you are no longer welcome in this house. Your accounts will be frozen. Your name will be removed from the business registry by week's end. The life you know ends here." Charles nodded once, his voice a murmur of defiance. "Good." He turned and walked out. By nightfall, society reeled. The news spread from the Vanderbilt mansion to the parlors of Madison Avenue, down to the gentlemen's clubs and up to the tea salons where women sipped behind lace gloves and gasped behind fans. Charles Vanderbilt had walked away from his inheritance. For love. For her. Margaret. And while the city whispered and speculated, Margaret herself sat in her mother's parlor, sewing in silence beneath the dim glow of a single lamp. She had not yet heard. But the knock at the door was not unexpected. When she opened it, he stood there, Charles. His coat was dusted with snow, his collar turned up against the wind, but his eyes burned with something bright and raw. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she saw the exhaustion in his face, the ache hidden behind his determined stance, and she understood. "You did it," she whispered. "I had to." Margaret's breath caught. She reached for the back of the chair to steady herself. "You left everything." "I left nothing that mattered." Her heart ached with admiration and terror in equal measure. "You don't understand what you've done." "Yes, I do. They'll destroy you. They already tried." "I don't want to be the reason." "You are not the reason," he interrupted, crossing the room to stand before her. "You are the reason I can breathe." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back with all her strength. Evelyn's soft cough came from the next room. Margaret glanced toward the bedroom, then back at him. "You can't stay," she said. "I'm not asking to." He looked around the modest room, so different from the marble halls he had abandoned. "I came to tell you that whatever happens next, it will be of your choosing. Not mine, not my father's, yours." Then he placed a small envelope on the table and left without waiting for a reply. Inside the envelope, she found a pressed sprig of lavender and a note written in a hand she now knew better than her own heartbeat. "For the first time in my life, I am free. That freedom is not worth living without you." She clutched it to her chest, her eyes stinging, but with love the weight only grew heavier. The following day brought a fresh torment. Isabella Harrington, radiant in emerald silk and fury, appeared in the company of two of her society confidants at a popular cafe, where her voice carried just enough for the reporters at the neighboring table to overhear. "It's tragic, truly," she said, sipping her chocolate. "They say her father was dismissed from a bank for embezzlement. Quietly, of course. No trial. But these things, they linger, don't they?" One of the women gasped, delighted. "I had no idea." Oh, darling," Isabella replied, her voice like honey over glass. "There's much the Whitfields have kept hidden." Within days, the gossip had a life of its own. Margaret, unaware of the lie's origin, heard it first from a shopkeeper's wife. "Some say your father left town in disgrace," the woman whispered, peering around before adding, "I never believed it, of course, but people talk." Margaret froze, her body rooted to the street. It was not true. Her father had died when she was still a girl, quietly, honorably, a clerk with clean books and little to leave behind. But now his memory was being used to tarnish hers, and she knew precisely who had started it. She returned home in silence and sat at her mother's side, watching the frail rise and fall of Evelyn's breath. Her chest burned with shame, rage, and helplessness. What kind of life could she give her mother now? What kind of future could she offer Charles? She stood before the cracked mirror above the hearth, searching her own reflection for answers. Her gown was faded, her hair pinned simply. Her face held traces of sorrow, yes, but also defiance. She touched the pendant she wore, a small silver locket her father had given her, and in that still moment, the decision began to form in her heart. A woman could not let a man give up the world for her, not unless she was willing to face that world at his side or walk away entirely. She stepped into the night with the wind pressing against her cheeks, her shawl pulled tight, her breath visible in the cold. Each step was heavy, but she kept walking, because love, no matter how noble, demanded courage, and she had never needed courage more than now. Snow fell in silent flurries across the rooftops of Manhattan, covering the city in a delicate hush that belied the storm stirring behind shuttered doors and aching hearts. The scandal of Charles Vanderbilt's public declaration had barely cooled, yet its aftershocks continued to rattle the marble corridors of the elite. In the days that followed the Harrington dinner, invitations were withdrawn. Partnerships hesitated. Old friends turned cautious. But Charles did not waver. He left the Vanderbilt mansion with nothing but a single trunk and a name that now burned on the tongues of both admirers and enemies. The streets he once crossed in carriages, he now walked on foot, coat collar upturned, breath visible in the cold. But he moved with purpose, always toward the same place, toward her, Margaret. He found her on a grey morning, not in her workshop or at her mother's bedside, but at the station, her gloved hands trembling as she passed her meagre bag to the porter. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw set, but her eyes, those grey-blue eyes that had haunted him, were rimmed with unshed tears. She had chosen to leave. He stepped onto the platform with long strides, the wind lifting the hem of his coat, and she turned at the sound of his voice. "You're running," Charles said. Margaret's breath caught. "I'm protecting you," she replied, barely louder than the train whistle in the distance. "You think I need protection from you? I think you've lost everything because of me." The snow swirled between them like ghosts. Charles shook his head. "I lost everything the moment I chose to live a lie. What I've gained, Margaret, is the right to be the man I was meant to be. You don't understand?" "I understand perfectly," he said, stepping closer. "You're afraid. So am I. But fear won't save us. It won't feed your mother. It won't clear your father's name. It won't heal what's already broken." Her gaze faltered at the mention of her father. "You've heard," she whispered. He nodded. "The rumor. Yes. And you still came." "I came because I searched. I looked through the records myself, Margaret. The bank documents, the ledgers, the accusations made and withdrawn. Your father was never convicted of anything. He was blamed by men who wanted a scapegoat after a failed investment. He died with his name unproven, not disgraced. Margaret's knees nearly buckled, but she remained standing. I never knew, she murmured. No one wanted you to, Charles said gently. Least of all Isabella. Tears escaped down her cheeks, silent and unbidden. I can't let you live like this, she said, without your inheritance, without your future. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. My future, he said, is in the way you look at me. It's in the letters I wrote and never sent. It's in the nights I stayed awake imagining the sound of your voice. Margaret, I've never wanted anything in my life the way I want to walk beside you, as your equal, as your partner, as your husband. Her lips parted, her heart pounding with something dangerously close to hope. But I'm not your equal, she said bitterly. Not in their eyes. Then let them go blind. The train whistled again, a mournful cry. The porter looked up expectantly. Margaret inhaled slowly and stepped back. I'm not going, she said quietly. Charles's breath left him in a rush, as if he had been holding it since the day she tried to disappear. They did not kiss. Not there. Not yet. But their foreheads touched, gently, their hands entwined, and the snow fell around them like benediction. Later that day, the city received a different kind of shock. Cornelius Vanderbilt collapsed in the middle of his study. The servants ran in all directions. Doctors were summoned. His breathing was shallow, his lips pale. For 2 days, the house that once hosted the most coveted parties in Manhattan became a vigil of whispered prayers and unspoken reckonings. Charles was summoned reluctantly. He entered the grand home with slow, deliberate steps, not as a disgraced heir, but as a man who had carved a life outside its walls. He found his father propped against pillows, his hands trembling, but his gaze still sharp. You're here, Cornelius rasped. I am. There was a long silence. You've ruined everything, the old man said. Charles didn't respond. Cornelius turned his head slightly. But you didn't run. No. The older man closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something softer flickered there, something Charles had never seen in him. I saw the paper, Cornelius whispered. The girl's father. You were right. Charles sat beside the bed. It was never about being right. Cornelius studied his son's face, his breathing shallow. She's strong, he murmured. Stronger than I expected. Charles smiled faintly. She always was. Cornelius closed his eyes once more. This time he did not speak, but the message had been given, not a blessing, not an apology, a quiet surrender. Across town, in the modest parlour where frost still clung to the window pane, Evelyn Whitfield lay beneath a quilt, her skin waxen, her breath shallow. Margaret sat beside her, smoothing a damp cloth across her brow. You always wanted love, Evelyn murmured. Not like this, Margaret replied, not with war at every doorstep. Her mother's lips curled faintly. Every love worth having must survive the siege. Margaret's throat tightened. You think we'll make it? I think, Evelyn whispered, that love without courage is only half-lived. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as her mother reached for her hand. I have lived enough, Evelyn said. Now it's your turn. Night fell over the city, wrapping it in velvet silence. Gas lamps flickered behind frosted glass. Carriages passed, wheels muffled by snow, and in the hearts of two souls who had risked everything, love began to take root, not in fantasy, not in wealth, but in truth. A truth hard-earned, a truth worth everything. The snow had stopped falling the morning the city awoke to whispers of the wedding. Pale light broke through silvered clouds, casting a muted glow over the rooftops of Manhattan, as though the sky itself had chosen reverence. And behind the grand windows of parlors and breakfast rooms, people spoke of only one thing. Charles Vanderbilt, heir-turned-renegade, was marrying Margaret Whitfield, the seamstress who had nearly been ruined, and yet had refused to bow. The announcement had not come in a formal notice in the society pages. It had not been sealed with a family crest, nor signed by matriarchs or dowagers. It arrived instead like a quiet wind that rustled lace curtains and unsettled fine china, a soft rebellion made flesh. There would be no ballrooms filled with foreign nobility, no royal cousins, no extravagant processions down Fifth Avenue, but there would be a wedding, and the guest list, though modest, included those who mattered, those who had chosen truth over spectacle. In a warm upper chamber on the west side of the city, Margaret stood before a tall mirror, her hands smoothing the bodice of a gown she had stitched herself in quiet hours by lamplight. The silk, a rich shade of champagne, hugged her frame with elegant restraint. The neckline curved gently over her collarbones, modest but feminine. Tiny pearl buttons, fastened one by Evelyn's trembling hands just days before, ran along her spine like a whispered blessing. Her hair was swept back in soft waves, a few strands left loose to frame her face, adorned only with a silver comb that had once belonged to her mother. There were no diamonds, no veils of lace sewn in Paris, no tiaras borrowed from distant aunts. Only Margaret, her heart, her courage, her vow. As she stood before the mirror, her fingers trembling lightly at her sides, she remembered the first time she'd entered a ballroom, not as a guest, but as a worker in shadows. She had mended torn silk while chandeliers glittered above her, never imagining she would one day walk beneath them as someone cherished, chosen. She turned, and Lady Beatrice Wickliffe, one of the few society women who had defended her, nodded in approval from her place near the window. "You look like no one else," the older woman said, "which is precisely why you are unforgettable." Margaret smiled. "That wasn't the intention, but it is the result." Meanwhile, in a quiet room across town, Cornelius Vanderbilt lay propped against pillows, his body weakened by illness, his breath short, but his mind as sharp as ever. The newspaper rested on his lap, the headline bold, "Vanderbilt wedding draws line between old wealth and new values." He did not flinch at the headline. He had seen it coming. What he hadn't expected, what still unsettled him, was the sight of his son, returning again and again to sit beside him in silence. Charles had brought no anger, no accusations, only his presence, and that somehow was more effective than any argument. It was during one such visit that Cornelius had seen something unexpected. Margaret. She had come to check on Charles, not knowing the old man was awake. She had stepped into the room quietly, holding a folded shawl and a worried gaze. Her eyes moved to the elder Vanderbilt, and for a moment they simply regarded one another, not as enemies, not even as opponents, but as two people who understood what it meant to love someone so deeply it rearranged every belief they'd ever held. She had not bowed or begged. She had simply said, "If you're strong enough, he'll never know I came." And she left. Cornelius had said nothing, but he remembered. And so, when Charles asked him if he would attend the ceremony, even if only from a distance, behind the comfort of a carriage window, Cornelius had closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and said, "Marry her." He would never call it a blessing. That was not his way, but in that quiet permission every barrier fell. That afternoon, in a modest yet exquisitely decorated chapel surrounded by ivy-covered brick, Margaret walked down the aisle not in shame or shadow, but in the full light of day. Gas lamps flickered above, a small string quartet played a subdued melody. The pews were filled with faces that had once turned away from her, now softened by time, scandal, and the undeniable power of sincerity. Lady Wickliffe sat beside Mrs. Travers, both wearing violet. A few editors from less vicious publications sat near the back, pens tucked into their coat pockets, scribbling discreet notes. And in the final row, a closed carriage window cracked open just enough to reveal the eyes of Cornelius Vanderbilt, watching without being seen. When Margaret reached the altar, Charles took her hand. No gloves, no hesitation. The officiant began, and the city held its breath. There were no gasps when they said "I do," No interruptions, no objections, only the quiet reverence of two souls choosing one another despite every reason not to. Later that evening, a modest reception was held at the Wycliffe estate. The ballroom, smaller than the Vanderbilt's but no less grand, was filled with flickering candlelight, fresh winter roses, and the soft clinking of glasses raised in tentative joy. Margaret stood near the edge of the room, her hand resting lightly on Charles's arm, watching as old enemies avoided her gaze, and new allies smiled with shy warmth. Across the ballroom, Isabella Harrington stood alone. She had arrived uninvited, escorted by her ever-present aunt, claiming courtesy and tradition. But no one approached her, no one offered her a glass or asked her to dance. She watched the couple in silence, her gloved hands folded before her. The woman she had tried to destroy now stood in the very place Isabella had once believed was hers by right. And though she held her posture high and her jaw set, Isabella felt the final crack within her certainty. She left quietly before the first waltz. As the music began, Charles turned to Margaret, his expression open, unguarded. "May I have this dance?" She looked around the room, the same society that had once scorned her now watching with cautious curiosity, and smiled. "I've waited my whole life for someone to ask me that in truth." He led her to the center of the ballroom. They danced slowly, a waltz familiar in rhythm but made new by meaning. The chandeliers above, once the witnesses of whispers and shame, now reflected only admiration. In Charles's arms, Margaret moved with grace that needed no permission, no title, only love. Around them the world faded, and for a moment, just one perfect, breathless moment, it no longer mattered that she had begun as a seamstress, or that he had once been the heir to an empire. What mattered was this: she had chosen love, and he had chosen her. Together, they had sewn a future from torn fabric, stitched with defiance, trimmed in dignity, and bound forever in devotion. And beneath the same chandeliers that had once cast shadows over scandal, Margaret Whitfield became Margaret Vanderbilt. Not in name alone, but in every truth that mattered. Her fate, once shaped by whispers, was now written in vows. A new story had begun, one not given, but claimed. The year was 1892, and New York City, like the world beyond it, had changed. The skyline had grown taller, the streets busier, and the carriages faster. The gas lights that once flickered at twilight had begun to give way to electric bulbs, and whispers that once held the power to destroy now dissolved beneath the din of progress. But amidst the noise and transformation, at the edge of Gramercy Park, there stood a townhouse wrapped in ivy, its windows aglow with warmth and memory. Inside, the scent of fresh bread and old books mingled with laughter. A small boy, no older than 7, darted across the parlor with a wooden train clutched in his hand, his dark curls bouncing, his cheeks flushed with joy. Behind him followed a girl with ribbons in her braids and the quiet composure of someone who had inherited both discipline and grace. In the doorway, Margaret stood watching them with a smile that deepened every line at the corners of her eyes. Time had softened her face, but not her spirit. She wore a pale house gown, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the edges of a hem she was stitching peeked from her sewing basket nearby. From the study came the sound of a page turning. Charles, now older, his hair streaked with grey at the temples, still carried the same steady light in his eyes. He had left behind the boardrooms and headlines long ago, trading them for a quieter legacy, one built in pages and people, not numbers and fortunes. He had written 3 books on ethics, labour and industrial reform, and had helped fund schools for working-class children. But the greatest title he had ever claimed was husband and father. The children were theirs, born not from convenience or social duty, but from a love that had defied an empire. From the mantel, a photograph in sepia tones showed their wedding day. Behind the glass, Margaret's silk gown still glowed with the same quiet strength. Another frame held a small silver comb, the one her mother had placed in her hair that morning, the morning Evelyn had been well enough to see her daughter walk toward joy. Evelyn they had buried 3 years later, beneath the weeping willow in Greenwood Cemetery. Her gravestone carved simply, she taught her daughter how to love with courage. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, long past, had left behind an empire that did not remember him kindly nor cruelly, but with the complex respect earned by men who changed when it mattered most. He had attended only one family dinner after the wedding, silent, tired but present, and it had been enough. Isabella Harrington, once the jewel of the season, now lived in London with her second husband, a minor aristocrat whose fortune had vanished in a failed railway venture. She had not been invited to the funeral of her aunt, nor had she returned to New York since. Her name had slowly faded from the circles she once ruled. Some said she lived quietly, others whispered of bitterness. None knew for certain. As for Margaret, she had become a name whispered not with scandal, but with admiration. She had opened her own atelier 2 years after the wedding, not to chase prestige, but to employ women like she once had been, talented, invisible, overlooked. The sign above the door read, "Whitfield and Cumberder Fine Dressmakers," and behind its windows dreams were sewn with care. Her daughter, now 5, had inherited her father's eyes and her mother's stillness. She sat beside Margaret in the mornings, learning to thread needles with solemn determination. Her son, more restless, had already asked 100 questions that week, all of which Charles answered as if each were the most important inquiry in the world. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Charles sat in the back garden beneath a canopy of late spring blossoms. The same stars that had once watched them suffer now shimmered above them in silence, bearing witness to their triumph. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked softly, her hand resting on his. He turned to her surprised. "What?" "Walking away from all of it." Charles looked up at the sky, then back to her. "I didn't walk away," he said. "I walked towards something." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "And did you find it?" He leaned in, his lips brushing her knuckles with the reverence of a man still astonished by his own good fortune. "I found you," he said. "That was always the destination." They sat there, the scent of jasmine between them, the distant hum of the city a lullaby to all they had built. The world had changed. They had changed. But love, true, tested, unshaken love, had endured. And though she had once been nothing more than a seamstress in the shadows, Margaret Whitfield Vanderbilt had become something far greater. She had become the woman who taught New York that worth was not worn, it was earned, and that one kiss, once whispered in scandal beneath chandeliers, had been the beginning of everything. In a world ruled by fortune, reputation, and appearances, Margaret and Charles dared to choose love. Their journey reminds us that true courage is not found in grand gestures, but in quiet moments, when we stand firm for the ones we love, even when the world tells us not to. Margaret began as a seamstress, overlooked and ridiculed by society, but she held on to her dignity, her dreams, and her heart. And in the end, it was not wealth or legacy that triumphed, but the unwavering bond between two souls who refused to give up on each other. This story teaches us that love, when chosen with courage, can reshape destiny. If this tale touched your heart, tell us in the comments what moment moved you the most. And if you made it all the way here, write the word courage below. That one word that changed Margaret's fate and can change ours too. Don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone who still believes in love that conquers all. And if you're craving more historical romances filled with passion, scandal and redemption, be sure to check the stories I've left for you in the cards. There's always another heart waiting to beat a little faster. Thank you for listening. Your presence here keeps these stories alive.